He's Dhruva is a visiting, well not a visiting fellow, you're a fellow at Brookings in Delhi with a focus on foreign policy. So he's one of 3 fellows based at the Brookings Institute and will be talking to us today about foreign policy from an Indian context with a focus on India in a volatile neighbourhood. But a few of you have had a chat with Dhruva over breakfast and asked for some specific focuses, which I think you'll touch on today, and things that you haven't touched on previously over the course of the last 2 weeks. And I think, Dhruva, your intention is that this is probably more interactive than a lecture, so really hoping that you guys will ask questions, because it's great to have a guest lecturer, someone who lives and breathes foreign policy in an Indian context. And Dhruva is a regular commentator, particularly in print journalism, but has also spent the last week or so at various dialogues, the Raisina dialogue and Indo-Australia dialogue, and I think at least 1 or 2 a week, probably such speaking and roundtable engagement. So it's fantastic to have him up here at campus, and I encourage you guys to ask questions in addition to sort of just listening, because hopefully this will be a bit more interactive. And now I'll hand it over to you, Dhruva.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean. Thank you all for being here. Just a little bit about myself. As Sean mentioned, I work at a think tank here called Brookings India. It's an affiliate of the think tank called the Brookings Institute, which is based in Washington. And Brookings in Washington, at least, is one of the oldest, it's over 100 years old now, public policy research institutes, at least one of the oldest in the world. It's certainly very establishment in Washington, D.C. It's often, many people who work there tend to go into the US government or have come out of the US government. And we set up an office here in India about 4 years ago now, where we do research on aspects of Indian public policy. So I work with, we all work on different subjects. I work with an economist, an energy technologist, and myself, and we have some other affiliated scholars who are trade economists and who work on other issues as well. And I'd say just one of the things, a lot of public misconceptions, I'm happy to talk about it in more detail, about what think tanks do. I like to describe it in a few ways. One is, in some ways, we're a bit like a university minus the students, so we try to do academic research. But the other thing we do, I think, is we're a bit of a go-between. We're a neutral actor that sits somewhere in between government, academia, the media, and business. And so while we work with people in all of those sectors, in some ways we overlap, but we don't quite do exactly the same functions as those different areas. One of the things, I do technically work on foreign policy, but I think it's important to not just talk about Indian foreign policy without context. And so what I'll try to do, and I was looking over the people who have spoken to you so far, and I don't want to go and repeat the stuff that they have said. But you seem to have covered quite a lot of ground between military power, government, soft power, South China Sea, India's Look East policy. And so what I thought I would do is try and synthesize some of these into a cohesive whole, because I do think that they all fit in together, and domestic policy and foreign policy are very closely linked, not just in India, but in India as well. And so I'll try and just sort of summarize all of this and just talk for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have about an hour if you want to ask me about anything I mentioned, but also any other topics, if to the best of my knowledge, to the best of my abilities, I'll try to address those as well. You've now been in India, what, a couple of weeks, is it now? And it's, I think one of the things you will have noticed, particularly traveling even a little bit outside of Delhi, is that India is just incredibly big. It's just mind-bogglingly big, and one statistic that I like to cite is there are about as many 10-year-olds in India as the entire population of Australia. So there were in 1 year there were as many Indians born, and this was 10 years ago. And that was the peak year, by the way. This was about 2007 or so, 2006, 2007, as the entire population of Australia. And it's also incredibly diverse. You have more. Just to talk about religious diversity, of course, you have 80% of the population is 79% of the population is Hindu, but we have more Muslims than Egypt and Iran combined. More Buddhists in Cambodia, more Christians in Portugal. This is and that's just religious diversity, linguistic diversity, and there are other kinds of diversity as well. And so I think that is also equally mind-boggling. And so what I think this means for other countries is that the opportunities in India are just immense. India is, just to give you some examples, India is the largest arms importer of any country in the last 5 years. It has the second largest number of internet users after China, so more than the United States. It's the third largest oil importer of any country. It's got the fourth most cars on the road, although sometimes it seems like it's got more than any other country as well. It's the fifth largest producer of renewable energy already. And so in a number of ways, India is already beginning to impact the world in different ways. It's shaping the global arms market, the global oil market already. And some of the change is also staggering. Currently, India is the seventh largest passenger airline in terms of number of domestic passenger airliner, people traveling on airlines. It will soon, just in the matter of about 3 to 5 years, it will be the third largest airline passenger number. So that rate of change is really quite staggering as well. Now, just as the opportunities are immense, so are the challenges. And I think it's important not to forget about these. The GDP per capita of India is less than Sudan. About 1/4 of all Indian adults do not know how to read and write officially, and the unemployment is even more than that. India has more than half of all new cases of leprosy in the world are in India alone. And if you look at most other communicable diseases as well, the numbers in India are staggering. India has the largest number of new tuberculosis cases. So if you look at public health, if you look at education, even basic education, if you look at basic income, India still has a very long way to go. While there have been massive improvements since Indian independence, and I think this should not be overlooked, if you look at where India was 70 years ago, less than 20% of the population could read or write. There'd been pretty much no per capita growth for 40 years preceding that. So if you look at where India has come, it's very significant and positive, but India still has a very long way to go on most per capita indicators of human development. Now, as India is developing, there are some important changes taking place around the world. And I would say there are 4 that are of global consequence, but also of direct relevance to India. One is the rise of China. If India's growth has been impressive, and I think it has been over the last 25, 30 years, China's has been on another order of magnitude. And it's something we should all be celebrating in many ways. China has it now drives global markets. It's become the world's factory, a major exporter. It's become a leader in infrastructure. It's pulled the largest number of people out of poverty in history. But there are big concerns also related to the rise of China. And I would say that there are 4 major concerns. One is that it retains a system of governance that is opaque, and the U.S. is a major international power, but it has a relatively open system of governance. It actually invites other countries to participate in its own politics. And in China, we see when a decision is made, we're not always entirely sure how that decision is made, why that decision is made. And it was one thing if China was just governing itself. As its international power increases, this is more and more of a cause of concern. 2, we've seen, while China has been very successful economically, we are not seeing it necessarily practice what we would often think of as market economics. That is, you have very significant state subsidies for many industries, which give it mean that it's not always playing on the same level playing field as firms from other countries. We sometimes see non-tariff barriers against key industries. We see a very close link between state-owned enterprises and the private sector. And this again is a cause of concern because it's creating market distortions in many countries, including in India. The third development, and I don't think this is a major change in the last few years, although it remains a major concern, is, for lack of a better word, international terrorism. So it's fluffy, it's taking different forms, it takes different forms in different countries and at different points of time. But it remains a major international concern for the internal security of countries as diverse as Australia and India, but also Nigeria, the United States, and the Philippines, and Europe. So that remains a major concern, and India is in many ways on the front lines of some of those challenges. And the fourth big change, again from India's perspective at least, is that India's own capacity has increased. And so many of the things that India could not afford to do a few years ago are now, we can start beginning to contemplate playing a role in certain areas that it was not able to previously. So just with this backdrop, I mean, the opportunities and challenges inherent domestically within India, and then the changing international environment, what does this mean for India going forward? One is, I think, the biggest challenge will be developing India. And I don't just mean this in terms of income and GDP growth, that's all good and nice and necessary, but I just mean developing India as a modern society that is comparable to, in some ways, to advanced middle income and then advanced economies around the world. And what this means is, what this requires India to do, at least apart from domestic governance reforms and improvements, is sourcing technology. I mean, I would say that this would be impossible without external support, without foreign support, and without technology, without investment, and without learning best practices from others. And so this, I think, is the number one priority for the government when it engages the rest of the world. And you see this when Prime Minister Modi, for example, goes overseas and he meets members of the Indian diaspora and asks them to invest in India. He's actually in Davos in Switzerland right now trying to sell India to the captains in global industry. But again, beyond just sort of investment, foreign direct investment and manufacturing and job creation here, which again is a big priority, I think there needs to be a more comprehensive way of looking at this. And this extends to healthcare, to agricultural productivity, to defense and internal security, to governance, to infrastructure. And in all of these areas, again, India can develop, and it could develop on its own, and it is developing on its own, but it could certainly accelerate that process with external assistance. One example I like to give is the Delhi metros. Have any of you been on the Delhi metro recently? No. I mean, if you step on it, it's really crowded and all of that, but it functions. I mean, you could be, without the people there, you could be in Tokyo. And there's a reason for that, because the Japanese government actually invested about, in the first phase, 60% of the financing for it came from Japan. A lot of the technical assistance came from Japan to build the first few lines of the metro. The first trains were produced in South Korea. The second batch of trains were produced in Germany by a Canadian company. The training for the operators was done in Hong Kong by the Hong Kong Metro Transit Authority. So, I mean, just to give you this one metro rail system, which now has over 1 billion riders per year, benefited, it started building in 1998. The first lines started in the early 2000s. By 2006, you had 3 full lines complete. And so in less than a decade, you actually had a metro rail system come up, which is relatively safe and transports a very large number of people, which has changed the landscape of Delhi, and which has had a replicating effect. So now there are another 7 other metro systems in operation around India, and another 7 in development. So we'll have 15 metro rail systems around the country soon. And this was all made possible. Again, India could have tried to do all of this on its own, and probably would have taken much longer, it wouldn't have been as efficient, it may not have been as good. But it was able to accelerate all of that with foreign assistance, and different kinds of foreign assistance. A second priority, I would say, beyond developing India is the immediate neighborhood. And I think, again, in India, there's sometimes a tendency to overlook our immediate smaller neighbors, because India likes to think of itself as a big power. But this is nonetheless a very important issue. And I would say 5 countries in particular, which are Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. And the reason I give those 5 countries is for all of them, their most important external partner is India. So when they have a domestic problem, the first country they turn to is India. There's another reason, which is their domestic politics overlap with India's domestic politics. So dissident groups in these countries come to India and are often based here. You have overlapping ethnicities. So you have a Tamil minority in Sri Lanka. You have a very large Tamil minority, 60 million plus in India. And so there is a kind of a a sympathy sometimes for the fate of people in these other countries. The same with people in Bihar and in southern Nepal, or people known as Madeshis, in Bangladesh, between people in West Bengal and Bangladeshis. And so this is often becomes a very important domestic political issue, the relations with these neighbors. What we've seen happen in all of these countries at various points of time in the last 10 years has been growing democratization. And this, in the long run, this is a good thing. In the short term, it's often very painful and difficult. And in some cases, including particularly the Maldives recently, we've seen a counter backlash, we've seen a counter reverse of democratization there. But in many of the other countries, that democratization often translates into growing nationalism, as politicians try to appeal to their electorates. And very often that nationalism is defined as anti-Indianism. It is, the national identity is by definition not being part of India. So in each of these countries we are seeing in some ways growing nationalist sentiments and growing polarization. And India is very much part of that narrative, for better or for worse. Another development has taken place, which is China is now being able to play the role of a secondary actor in all of these countries, and is able to present itself as an alternate to India. And it takes different forms. In Nepal, it's primarily political. In Sri Lanka and Maldives, it's primarily economic. In Bangladesh, it's primarily military. But in all these countries, they can now say, well, if India is not helping us, we can always turn to China. And so there's this weird marriage now of nationalist sentiments in many of these countries and growing Chinese influence. And this is what has created a great deal of insecurity for India. And so you're starting to see India now in some ways have to deal with these countries on very different terms. And this is not going to be a short-term, there's not going to be a short-term fix to any of this. At the present juncture, for example, there are governments in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka that are, for lack of a better word, very positively disposed towards India and have very constructive relations with India. Whereas in Nepal and the Maldives, you have currently governments in power that are less so. And so I think dealing with this is going to be a challenge going forward. A third challenge has to do with the broader region and the effects of China's rise on this broader region. And we can define this broader region as the Indo-Pacific, which is a term that was popularized actually in Australia. It's now used in the Foreign and Defense white papers, but has now come into common use here in India as well. And what this really means is there are shared concerns across this region, from Japan to East Africa, but including India and Australia, about some of the implications of China's rise. And as I mentioned earlier, this has to do with a relatively opaque system of governance, often mercantilist economic policies, questions about China's willingness and ability to uphold the international order and a rules-based international order. And also, occasionally, China's unwillingness to abide by the territorial status quo. We're seeing this in disputes in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, and in the Himalayas with India and Bhutan. So what is India doing about this? I think one is refocus on the Indian Ocean, and I think you heard from Darshana and perhaps others about some of this. And we have seen, sitting in Delhi, which is the capital, continental preoccupations often take priority, take precedence. But India has a very large coastline, and in fact the areas of highest growth for India are largely in the west and south, tend to be more maritime in nature. So I think refocusing on the Indian Ocean, developing closer relations with small island countries like Mauritius and Seychelles. The Indian Navy has stepped up patrols across the Indian Ocean from the Straits of Malacca to the southwest Indian Ocean. You're seeing India develop infrastructure in Mauritius and Seychelles and Madagascar and in the Middle East, some of which is civilian in nature, some of which is military in nature. So I think that's been one big change in the last few years. The second big change related to this has been refocus on engagement with Southeast Asia and ASEAN. Actually, just this week, we're going to see all 10 leaders of the ASEAN countries coming to India for the Republic Day celebrations on the 26th of January. And this marks the 25th anniversary of India-ASEAN, formal India-ASEAN relations. I would say that politically and militarily, India has become much more integrated with Southeast Asia. Commercially, it still has a very long way to go. And efforts at trying to play a bigger trade role, particularly in Southeast Asia, have not gone very far. It's for a number of reasons. One of them has to do with Myanmar, Burma, which for many years was very internally oriented, which actually created a sort of buffer between the rest of Southeast Asia and India. That has now changed slightly, but there are many other reasons to do that. The third element of India's Act East policy in terms of preserving a stable balance in the Indo-Pacific beyond the Indian Ocean and ASEAN outreach is deepening particularly security partnerships with other major like-minded powers in the region. And I would say three stand out in particular: the United States, Japan, and Australia. All our democratic countries, all our maritime powers, all have shared and similar concerns about China's rise, and therefore working more closely with these countries, particularly in the defense realm, makes sense. And many of you will have read recently that there was a meeting of those four countries on the sidelines of a major summit in the Philippines last November. It's commonly referred to as a Quad: India, Japan, Australia, United States. And then just last week here in Delhi, we had the Navy chiefs of those four countries on a panel together and meeting for the first time in that configuration. Beyond that, two other things. One, there's a major concern with terrorism and instability stemming from India's west. We're seeing a really deteriorating security environment in the Middle East more broadly, and also extending into Afghanistan and Pakistan. And India is often at the brunt of this. India has important interests in the Middle East. There are about 5 to 7 million Indians in the Middle East, mostly in the Gulf Arab states, many of them migrant workers. And their security remains a big priority. India is also very dependent on oil and gas imports from the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iraq, Kuwait, and the UAE. And India also has very important security concerns, including on terrorism and intelligence. And so we have seen in some ways a big outreach to the Middle East, particularly the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia recently, and Israel. We just had last week Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu here in India. Moving a little closer to home, I think one of the concerns that India has is in Pakistan is a country whose state apparatus, and specifically the army, uses terrorism as an instrument of state policy, as leverage against India, and actually funds and trains and supports and provides sanctuary to groups to attack Indian targets across the border. And so dealing with that challenge is difficult, particularly given that both sides have nuclear weapons, and that any kind of retaliatory measure threatens escalation between these countries. So managing the Pakistan relationship is an incredibly problematic one. We've seen some highs and lows just in the last few years. I'm happy to talk about that in more detail. And then linked between the Middle East and Pakistan, of course, is Afghanistan. And the stabilization of Afghanistan and its evolution into a sort of stable, at least quasi-democratic state will remain a big priority for India. India is the 5th largest aid donor to Afghanistan, and has been involved in some very major projects, including building the country's parliament, building a major dam to provide electricity to people. There are about 16,000 Afghan students here in India at any given time. There's training for military officers that India conducts. And so helping to stabilize Afghanistan remains another major priority. Finally, I think India is having to play a bigger role in terms of shaping institutional and international institutional norms and practices. And that sounds very fluffy, I know, but it has very concrete implications for a variety of areas. Among them are climate change, freedom of navigation and overflight, trade, at least at a global level, internet governance, and cybersecurity, space, and how the non-weaponization of space, and equally in other sort of areas related to global economics and security, arms control agreements and things like that. And in all of these areas, we've seen India playing a very different role than it did even 5 or 6 years ago. And just to give you 3 examples quickly, one is on climate change, where you had India previously at the Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2009 presenting climate change as a choice between development and environmental considerations. And I think what has changed, and the technology has partly enabled that, is many now seeing it as an opportunity to transition into a sustainable energy environment. Therefore, you saw India take a very different approach at the Paris Climate Summit just a couple of years ago. On freedom of navigation, we've seen India change its position again, now more in favor of, so another reason why we need more energy, renewable energy. We see India change its position again and taking a much more robust position on the South China Sea, and I think you've heard about that already. And on internet governance, I think you had India adopt a position a few years ago that was not that dissimilar to China and Russia, which was that the internet used to be governed by states, by state government, by national governments, to an approach now which is very different, and that gives a space in internet governance to private actors, including civil society groups. So just to summarize, I think what does this mean for particularly the India-Australia relationship? One, any ways in which Australia can help to accelerate India's development would be most welcome. And this isn't in the form of aid, and this should not be out of the goodwill of Australia's heart, but in ways that are mutually beneficial. And this could extend, of course, to issues of market access and trade. It could extend to agricultural modernization and productivity. It could extend to energy supplies. Australia is obviously a major exporter of energy. So there are a number of areas of potential cooperation, and many of them are being explored by the 2 governments. 2, I think, in terms of how Australia can help preserve a favorable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. Again, we have a lot of convergence here in terms of broader interests, a lot of shared sense of some of the challenges, and so I think that's a security cooperation in particular will be very important between the 2 countries. 3, I think on counterterrorism and cooperation, we've often had similar long-term concerns about Islamist terrorism, but in practice it has often been working across purposes. Australia, for example, was part of the international coalition against ISIS. India was not part of that. We sometimes don't see exactly eye to eye on issues like Iran and Pakistan and other things. So I think greater cooperation there is perhaps necessary. And finally, on global governance, I think a number of areas at the regional level and at the global level, I think are perhaps worthy of attention. Governing the Indian Ocean will be very important, and both countries are very active members of IORA, the Indian Ocean Rim Association. On global trade, just global skepticism has crept in about the benefits of global trade. I think there's a need to revisit some of it. On freedom of navigation and other issues as well. So I'm happy to take questions or comments on any of this. If there's something I did not address as well, I'm happy to try and answer those questions too. Thank you.
You guys don't ask questions, I would. Comment on the state of Kashmir and how that affects, we talk about a volatile neighborhood, we don't do foreign policy, but that's even a domestic volatile situation.
So I know a lot of questions on Kashmir, I'm happy to address it. I think a little bit of background is necessary for this. In 1947, when India and Pakistan became independent from what was then British India, was previously British India, there was a big outstanding question, which was what to do about what were called the princely states. These were several hundred, sometimes small, sometimes large, semi-autonomous entities that recognized the British as overlords, but had a great deal of independence when it came to their domestic governance. And they were scattered all over. Some of you would have gone to Jaipur, for example, which was a major princely state. Now, by the time independence came about on August 14th, 15th of 1947, the fate of all the princely states was more or less decided in terms of joining Pakistan or joining India. But 3 were outstanding. two of them, one is Junagadh in Gujarat, one is Hyderabad, which is a very large princely state in the center of India, were governed by Muslim leaders but had Hindu majority populations. And when they flirted with the idea of joining Pakistan, India basically coerced them using some military force to become part of India. Kashmir was the Jammu and Kashmir was the opposite. It was a Muslim majority state that was governed by a Hindu Maharaja, who opted, partly because of the geography, partly because of this situation, tried to opt for independence. What then happened was that you had Pakistani-backed forces that invaded and tried to effectively occupy or compel the Maharaja to join Pakistan. At which point he signed what was called an instrument of accession with India, and so legally joined the state of Jammu and Kashmir to India. So I mention all of this because I think it's important to get what makes Jammu and Kashmir different from other parts of India, and that's basically because of these circumstances. So India has a legal basis for its governance of Jammu and Kashmir. It is the only Muslim majority state in India, although not the only state in India where Hindus are minority. We have some Christian majority states as well. This has led to 3 wars between India and Pakistan over the state of Kashmir, and effectively most have ended in either, at least in this sector, have ended in a stalemate. In the late 80s and early 90s, we had the start of a popular insurrection in the Kashmir Valley. But just one more element. The state of Jammu and Kashmir, at least the part administered by India today, actually has 3 regions. The smallest by geography is the Kashmir Valley, where the majority of the population lives, and which is primarily Muslim. There are 2 other regions. One is Jammu, which is primarily Hindu, and Ladakh, which is the largest by area but is primarily Buddhist. They practice a strain of Tibetan Buddhism. So the issues largely relate to that a geographically small but densely populated valley, which is the Kashmir Valley. In the late 80s and early 90s, we had the start of a popular insurrection in the valley. This was to some degree motivated by local concerns, but it was also supported, including in material terms, by external actors, specifically Pakistan. And in many cases, we started seeing the infiltration of Mujahideen, some of whom had previously fought in Afghanistan against the Soviets, to support the cause of jihad in Kashmir. So it was started off as a non-religious protest movement, but very quickly took on a religious connotation. Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, this was basically crushed by the Indian Armed Forces with a very heavy hand. I would recommend this to you if you've not seen this already, but there's a film called Haider, which came out about 3 years ago, a Bollywood film, which is basically the story of Hamlet set in 1990s Kashmir. And I recommend it only because I think it captures some of the challenges in the valley at that time. By 2002, and there was in between all of this, there was an India-Pakistan war. India-Pakistan both went nuclear in 1998. But by 2002, 2003 or so, the insurrection started fading for a number of reasons. One, people got tired of violence. 2, I think after 9/11, there was limited international sympathy for the Kashmir cause. And 3, I think India started to do a better job of stopping cross-border infiltration. It's very difficult terrain, but maybe they start preventing militants from crossing over from Pakistan. And so the combination led to a decline in violence over much of the 2000s. What happened a couple of years ago, 2016 specifically, the summer of 2016, was we saw a return of popular protests. The immediate spark was the killing of a single militant named Burhan Wani, who had sort of taken on, using social media particularly, taken on this kind of Robin Hood type persona, but who was receiving arms and other support from across the border in Pakistan. And his killing by Indian security forces, which I mean that kind of thing happens all the time, for some reason led to this, was the spark that led to this renewed protests in the Kashmir Valley. Last summer we saw another return of this violence. It wasn't a one-off, it seems systemic. And one of the things that is noticeable is that particularly younger people in the Kashmir Valley who are very unhappy and who are participating in these protests. Across India, outside of the Kashmir Valley, there's a great deal of sympathy for the Indian government. And so while we are seeing, one other quick thing I should mention. There are a few parts of India, and this includes the state of Jammu and Kashmir, which operate under what's called the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. And this is effectively legal cover for the Indian military and police and security forces to basically violate what we would think of as civil liberties in other parts of the country. There are some states in northeast India that also have AFSPA in force. And so a great deal of so you do have curfews, for example, people cannot go out at night. At certain times the curfews are imposed by the state. So these are the conditions. There's a great deal of popular resentment against the government, but the possibility that many Kashmiris once had of an independent Kashmir or one that joined Pakistan is increasingly remote. And this has to do, I think, again, there's a great deal of popular will behind this, popular support for the state outside of the country. Pakistan's own reputation has declined. You've had the nuclearization of the subcontinent that makes it virtually impossible to imagine territory being forcefully exchanged. And so if you take all of these together, it doesn't bode well for them. So I think what we are in for is a period of heightened violence, and this might be generational in nature. But ultimately, I think we'll have to find a way to more firmly incorporate Jammu and Kashmir into the Indian state.
Have been, post-war and things like that, have there been any, meetings or conferences with the Indian government and the Pakistani government to come to terms and reach a peaceful agreement about Kashmir?
So I think one of the things that's very different from a lot of other conflicts is India and Pakistan have had relatively, at least politically, relatively normal relations throughout all of this. We've had diplomatic ties from 1947 that have not been suspended. We have ambassadors, high commissioners in each other's capitals. The problem, I think is actually more larger than that. In fact, it's that trade and people-to-people contacts are virtually non-existent. So it's very difficult for Indians to casually travel to Pakistan and vice versa. You have, if you have a visa, both countries issue visas only for specific cities, so you can't travel around the country. You can only go to, if you're in India, you're only allowed to go to Lahore and Islamabad, or if you're in Pakistan, you can only go to your primary destination. So that kind of traffic that India has, for example, with China, it's relatively easy for Indians and Chinese to do business with each other and travel to each other, even though we have a big territorial dispute. And we don't have that kind of relationship with Pakistan. But diplomatically, it's there, and you have the prime ministers meeting off and on, but at least on the sidelines of major summits. That. There was a major war in 1971 between India and Pakistan that actually had little to do with Kashmir at the beginning. It had to do with what was then East Pakistan, but is now Bangladesh. And basically, the Indian military invaded. So you had an election in 1970 that the party in East Pakistan won the majority, and the leaders of West Pakistan kind of refused to cede governance to them. And this led to a crackdown in East Pakistan, which resulted in a large number of refugees coming into India. After several months of this, India intervened militarily, decisively defeated the Pakistan army in East Pakistan, and that led to the creation of Bangladesh in 1972. After that, there was a summit in Shimla in India between the Indian and Pakistani leaders, where there was possibly an opportunity to settle their overall disputes. And for reasons that are somewhat mysterious but are poorly understood, India did not reach a final settlement. India and Pakistan did not reach a final settlement on Kashmir. They did on other things, but not on that. So I mean, one could look back upon that as a missed opportunity. Since then, there've been talks, but there doesn't seem to be anywhere closer to a solution. The closest perhaps we've been since then was under General Musharraf in Pakistan and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh here, where there was a proposal to not exchange territory but make the border between the two countries less relevant. And that would mean basically allowing some traffic across Indian and Pakistani Kashmir and basically a slow move towards normalization. For a variety of reasons that had to do with Musharraf's position in Pakistan, that did not materialize at that time. But I think for India, the issue between India and Pakistan goes well beyond Kashmir. It's a much larger issue that has to do with Pakistani identity. The view is, and I think this is corroborated by many, including many Pakistanis, is that the Kashmir cause is one that is heightened in Pakistan to basically preserve the privacy of the Pakistani army in Pakistani politics. So as long as you create this bogey of India and the need to fight for Kashmir's liberation and all of that, you're able to justify a very large chunk of the budget, you're able to maintain a so there's very little interest or there's no real incentive for the Pakistan army to resolve their disputes with India. The day those disputes are resolved, the Pakistan army loses. And so I think we have a situation that is not very different from, or it's analogous to how South Korea is dealing with North Korea. You're dealing with somebody who doesn't really want to engage with you, or doesn't want to do so in good faith. And that I think is the real problem that India faces. And the nuclear dimension only limits India's ability to bring Pakistan to the bargaining table, to the negotiating table.
So in a couple of our lectures so far, we've talked about how can we improve accessibility to India, and one of that is for international students making visas to come in a little bit quicker, etc. Because the e-visa is quite hard to get for students. Something just following up on the question of Pakistani-Indian relations and free movement within those countries. From the ANU perspective, we had a few people who were considering coming on this study tour, but because they're of Pakistani origin, they didn't end up coming because the visa process was incredibly long and in some ways quite invasive. Would there ever be a future of that changing in light of trying to, open up India to the rest of the world through education, which is a huge means of collaboration?
So I would say just along this whole broader issue. I mean, I think generally visas for most people visas to India have become easier. Now you can get in theory as a tourist, as a casual tourist, a business person, you can pretty much get in a day depending on which country you're from. But it's become easier for people of Indian origin to get what's called an overseas citizenship of India, which is basically a lifetime visa that gives you, the ability to work here, to study here, or a lot of benefits of Indian citizens, minus a passport and voting rights, pretty much. So there's been a good deal of visa liberalization taking place overall. Now there's some important exceptions, and one of them you noted correctly was people of Pakistani origin. Some of those stipulations, which in my mind are nonsensical and don't really make much sense, but were imposed after the 2008 Mumbai attacks, and they did not exist before that. They were really in response, and it's exactly what sometimes a government bureaucracy does when it panics and realizes they made a blunder. And what specifically happened was there was an individual who was half Pakistani, but a U.S. citizen, who made repeated visits to Bombay ostensibly as a businessman, but who basically did reconnaissance for the terrorists who attacked and passed on information about targets and all of that. This was discovered after the fact, but the fact that he came in unnoticed was largely because he changed his name so that he would have a Western sounding name. Yeah. Now it was one person who gamed the system, basically, right? And in response to that, the Indian government did something very ham-handed, which is it said, anybody like that is going to be under ridiculously extra scrutiny. Because anybody like that could be, even if they're saying they're coming as a tourist or a business person, could really be doing reconnaissance work. Now, in my mind, that's a bit ridiculous, because yes, you will have those exceptions, but the vast majority of people will not be. And you have these very strange things, like the way the questionnaire is asked is, do you have a grandparent that was born in Pakistan? And we have people who are Indian origin, whose grandparents were born in what is now Pakistan, but was then part of British India. And they say Karachi, and then of course they get all this extra scrutiny because they put that one grandparent was born in Karachi. Right? So it's a stupid system. And obviously that needs to be changed, but there is the security establishment here is very concerned that by watering those restrictions down, it would create room for people who do want to have more nefarious activity. Now, I personally think that there are ways, that you could have a very rigorous clearance process, but give, say, Pakistani business people more access to India, give Pakistani academics more access to India, because one of the things I've noticed, and I interact a lot with Pakistanis, mostly outside of India, unfortunately, is they have a very poor understanding of India. They don't come in groups like you do. They can't. And so they talk about, when they describe India, they describe an India that's projected to them. That is very much at odds with the India that actually exists. And I think, particularly India's successes, I think it would be good for Pakistanis, for average Pakistanis, to see more of it, and see that they would actually benefit from a more normal relationship with India. So I sympathize with that, and I think it's very short-sighted on the part of the Indian government, but I just want to give an explanation for why those concerns are there.
Still have time, guys.
You better ask questions, because I'm going to ask questions of you then.
So India's growing relations with Afghanistan has affected Pakistan very much. So why is it so?
So the situation in Afghanistan, both deliberately and otherwise, feeds the narrative in Pakistan of encirclement. That Pakistan has enemies all around, and particularly Indian enemies. And so you saw, even after 9/11, you had the US invasion of Afghanistan, you had the toppling of the Taliban government, a new government installed, and the narrative from the start in Pakistan was that this is going to lead to Indian encirclement. And so you had news reports, sometimes very legitimate media sources in Pakistan, of there being thousands of Indian spies running around Afghanistan, that they were planning attacks against Pakistan. Many of the attacks that did take place in Pakistan by the Taliban were seen to be actually Indian conspiracies or Indian links, so including there was an attack on the Sri Lankan cricket team in Lahore, which I heard from a senior Pakistani general the same day was, of course, Indians are behind this attack. So the non-Talibanization of Afghanistan feeds this narrative, and even if India was doing nothing at all there, you would still see some of this. The fact that India is doing something to try and support Afghanistan only adds to this, these imagined paranoid concerns in Pakistan. For a long time, this led to other countries, including the US and Europe, urging India not to play a bigger role in Afghanistan. India was actually excluded from many of the Afghan development conferences in the early years, basically out of deference for Pakistani sensitivities. I think after a point, I think the United States and others learned that this was really just paranoid nonsense, and that India was actually playing, despite this opposition, India was actually playing a mostly constructive role in developing Afghanistan. And so we're now seeing greater encouragement, including by Donald Trump in his South Asian strategy speech, for Indian support of Afghan redevelopment. So I think that has changed. But basically, from India's interest, it's a very real concern. So in 1999, actually, in December 1999, just as the new millennium was coming out, there was a hijacking of an Indian airliner from Kathmandu to Delhi. And that plane was diverted to a number of places, but eventually ended up in Kandahar, in Afghanistan. At the time, it was controlled by the Taliban. And so you had about 200 Indian citizens there in this territory. One was killed on the flight over. He tried to resist the attackers. And the hostages, again, with the support of this space in Afghanistan, the hijackers actually asked for the release of some Indian, some people in Indian custody, 3 individuals in fact. And finally, the Indian Foreign Minister had to fly himself, again with some considerable danger to himself, Jaswant Singh. He flew to Kandahar. In fact, one of the people with him was Ajit Doval, who is now the National Security Advisor, and released these 3 people. One of whom is Masood Azhar, who is the head of Jaish-e-Mohammed, which is a terrorist group based in Pakistan, who's on a UN sanctions list, UN watch list now. Whose group is, he is not. Another one of the people released was the man who went on to kill Daniel Pearl, who was a Wall Street Journal reporter who was beheaded in Karachi a few years later. And so, fortunately, all the Indian citizens, barring the one who was killed on the flight, were released safely. But I mean, I recount all of this only because it's a very concrete example of how the ungoverned or poorly governed spaces of Afghanistan can be used to affect, to very directly to hurt Indian interests and Indian security.
In terms of trade, we've seen China in recent years shifting its focus to areas of Africa and Latin America. Yeah. Is India following a similar trajectory?
So, I think it's something implicit in your question, which is trade is organic, right? International trade. It's not about I want to trade with you, right? It is you have something that I need and I have something that you need. And so, in some ways, if you had a completely flat, open international market, we would see trade take very organic. Trade flows, go where the demand is, come from where the supply is. So, in that sense, India has not made a kind of directed push to try and access markets in certain places. They've been India, on balance, India does enjoy. It does have a trade deficit with the rest of the world, meaning it imports much more than it exports. But a good amount of that is actually natural resources and say oil, for example. So we have seen a very conscious decision to move away from an over-reliance on Middle Eastern oil to other markets, and actually 3 big beneficiaries of that have been Angola, Nigeria, and Venezuela, so Africa and Latin America. And so that, I think in the energy sector, we've seen a very conscious decision to do that, again, mostly imports. But we haven't seen as much of a market push. A little bit of that is changing. We have seen greater demand from some countries in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Africa more to try and diversify away from China. And so just in the last year, for example, India offered $7 billion in lines of credit for exports to these countries. About 40% of that was in Africa. So there is a very, in that sense, a bit of an effort to try and turn it around. But on balance, I think India doesn't really do much in the way of exporting goods. Its goods exports are still quite modest compared to many other Asian economies. Where India's strengths lie are in 2 other areas, which are labor and services. And so you've seen sometimes India exporting labor, particularly to the Middle East, and exporting services globally. And in that sense, the biggest markets for India remain the United States, Europe, advanced economies, Japan, Australia, China to some extent. So I think that's been there. We are going to see more of, in terms of commodity, just because Indian demand is going to increase for a variety of commodities, we are going to see more imports from Latin America and Africa. But it's going to be raw material, not high quality trade.
I have a question about what are India's relations with Myanmar, especially with now Myanmar opening up with trade and things like that, and also the refugee crisis and
So Myanmar has always been a tricky relationship. Until the 1930s, Myanmar was part of India. Burma was. It was one of the territories of British India. It was hived off before independence. And at various points in time, there was always a very large Indian community in Burma. Many of them traders, and partly because of that and the socialist orientation that Myanmar took, it often led to a very fraught relationship between India and Myanmar, particularly in the 60s and 70s. In the 80s, India supported democratization there, Aung San Suu Kyi, after she won the election, but the military junta, therefore, initially they had a very poor relationship with it. What happened was there were concerns that Myanmar was becoming too overly dependent on China, and that led to India engaging more with the military junta in the 90s and 2000s. Today there are more opportunities than you are. I mean, I've been to Myanmar twice now in the last couple of years, and you can it's palpable. You can see the opening up, at least economically, the opening up there, and it has created opportunities for many other countries. But I would say the biggest beneficiaries, just because the base that is so low, have been the United States, have been Western Europe, Japan, to some extent some of the other ASEAN countries, Singapore, Thailand. India was the third largest trade partner with Myanmar before the opening up, after China and Thailand, but it was all very low. And so I think you have seen India has positively received the changes there. There's a good relationship with Aung San Suu Kyi today. But overland trade is still negligible. There's efforts to boost that. There's an India-Myanmar-Thailand highway that is under construction now. It should be completed by 2019, 2020. And if that is successful, that should hopefully facilitate some of that. It would also help the Northeast India's development as well. There are two other initiatives. There's one, India's been developing a port at Sitwe, which is very close to the Indian border, and trying to use that to link to Mizoram, the state of Mizoram, which is currently landlocked. But if this connect is there, it's not a great distance, but it would actually connect Northeast India to the sea via Myanmar. So that's an important initiative. It's been behind schedule, but it should hopefully be done soon. So there are now some increased opportunities, and I think India overall welcomes it. But if you look at India's relative share as an influencer in Myanmar has gone down, not at the expense of China or Southeast Asia, but at the expense of the United States, Japan, and others. And I think from India's point of view, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
I was just wondering if you could talk about India's relations with China.
Yeah. So it's a long history, and there are two very big powers growing in proximity to each other. It's a very complicated relationship in many ways, because it has many aspects and it has traditionally had many aspects of cooperation, but also a great deal of conflict. And I mean, I think that the low point was in 1962. In 1962, there was a border war between India and China, of which India was on the losing end, and that still casts it's over 50 years ago, but it still casts a very long shadow over India-China relations. I would say there are four elements broadly to the India-China relationship. One is there's a bilateral border dispute over a very large amount of territory, including almost all of one Indian state. And that, of course, is a very important issue. We have completely different ways for how we see the border between the two countries. There are ongoing negotiations. There have been dozens of rounds of negotiations between very senior leaders, but there is not yet an end sight to that. About once a year now, we've also seen a major standoff on this disputed border between Indian and Chinese troops, including a few months ago in Bhutan, which is interesting because it actually dragged a third country into it. China also has a border dispute with Bhutan. We saw the PLA trying to build a road in this disputed territory. Indian forces, which were very nearby, intervened and blocked the road construction, and this led to this standoff, which lasted 2 months between the two countries, and which was quite tense for a time. Eventually, they agreed not to build the road, and Indian forces went back onto their side of the border. But it was quite touchy for some time. The second element of the relationship is the bilateral economic relationship. So China is India's largest trade partner in goods, but it is of very poor quality of trade. It's largely Indian iron ore and other mineral resources going to China, and cheap manufacturing goods coming from China to India. So India has a very large trade deficit, about $50 billion a year with China. And there are increasing concerns in India that areas in which India has relative strength, say for example in pharmaceuticals and information technology, their companies are denied access to the Chinese market. So I think whereas about 10 years ago we were seeing the trade relationship and the economic relationship as a potential sign of cooperation, a potential area of cooperation, increasingly it's become an area of frustration, at least on the Indian side. So that's the second element. The third is regional security, and this relates to Pakistan, Afghanistan, the Indian Ocean, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Myanmar. And here, I mean, I think this is manifested most in China's Belt and Road Initiative, which India has very grave concerns about. And so the Belt and Road Forum, which took place last May in Beijing, India did not send anyone to it, it boycotted the forum. And instead it articulated what were principles for what it believed were good infrastructure, connectivity infrastructure building. So the Indian position is it was not against financing for roads and railways and the better development of that, but it needs to be done in a manner that is sustainable and equitable. That meets environmental standards, that benefits local communities, that is transparent in its financing and in terms of the bidding for those contracts. And the underlying message is that India didn't believe that the Belt and Road met those criteria. So while China tries to portray it as a win-win, I think there are very, very deep concerns in India about Belt and Road and the possible use of some of that infrastructure for military purposes, including in Pakistan, in Djibouti, in the Maldives, and Sri Lanka. So again, that I think is an increasing point of contention there. And finally, I think there was a good deal of cooperation between China and India on reforming global governance. So both are members of the BRICS coalition, and on climate change, there was largely China and India cooperated on many of these issues, at the UN on issues of sovereignty and intervention. But increasingly, I think we're seeing a parting of the ways for a variety of reasons between India and China on most of those issues. And I would say climate change perhaps remains the exception, where there's still a good deal of cooperation. So I think the picture I'm trying to paint is, while if you'd asked me that question 7, 8 years ago, I would have said, these are the areas of cooperation and these are the areas of competition. Today, I think we're seeing more and more competition and less cooperation on almost all of those issues. And I mean, I would say that the biggest reason for that is to do with developments within China, which is the centralization of power under Xi Jinping, we've gone away from the China that was of Deng Xiaoping, which was about biding your time, hiding your brilliance. It's now a much more assertive China. And so it's not related to India specifically, it's largely how China started to engage with the world. And India has been one of the casualties of that.
Could you speak briefly about the growing relationship between Israel and India?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting relationship because for many years, India, like many other parts of the world, particularly the developing world, did not have diplomatic ties with Israel. I think recognized Israel, but did not have diplomatic ties with it for many years. It was some of it was out of sensitivity to the large Indian Muslim population, and there was a belief, although I'm not sure if this was ever corroborated, that Indian Muslims would be opposed to a relationship with Israel and wanted India to support the Palestinian cause. And India had much closer relations with the supporters of that, which were Egypt, the Soviet Union in the latter part of the Cold War. In '92, we had, that being said, there was some low-level cooperation that was taking place even during the Cold War. There were shared concerns, for example, about the Pakistani nuclear program, because Israel believed that some of that technology, if Pakistan was successful, would transfer to some of Israel's enemies, and so there were shared concerns about that. Normal diplomatic ties only started in '92, after the end of the Cold War, so a little over 25 years ago. Since then, there's been a growing cooperative relationship. In fact, Israelis travel to India in very large numbers, particularly after their military service. So it's a very popular destination for Israeli tourists because they feel it's a relatively safe place for them to travel. The defense was another big area of cooperation. So India is the second largest recipient of Israeli defense exports after the United States. And there was also a good deal of intelligence cooperation between the two. A lot of this happened over the past 25 years, but without much of a public to-do about it. It was not. What I think has changed in the last few years is this government under Modi, for a variety of reasons, including domestic political reasons, has been much more open about the relationship with Israel. And so for the first time, you had an Indian president go to Israel last year, 2 years ago. You had a return visit by the Israeli president here. And then the two prime ministers have just swapped visits. So Modi made the first visit of an Indian prime minister to Israel last year, and then Netanyahu just came. It was actually the second visit by an Israeli prime minister. So we've seen a relationship in some ways come out of the closet. It was always there. It's always been quite warm, or at least the last quarter century it's been quite warm. There are a few very important areas of functional cooperation, including in agriculture and water. But we've now seen it sort of elevated to a much more public